Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum. I am your host Faisal Raza and you are watching Foresight. Viewers, 29th Conference of Parties or COP29 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was held from November 11th to 22nd November 2024 in Baku, Azerbaijan. The highly anticipated COP29 was considered as the COP of hope, the COP of action, the COP of finance. But it was overshadowed, first primarily due to the US presidential election and Trump's victory. And then lots of world leaders were absent from the COP, particularly from the United States, China, India, France, Germany, and European Commission. The summit seems more focused, unfortunately, on fossil fuels rather than the climate justice. Some of the successes were there, like financing for new collective quantitative goals, NCQG, slight movement on the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement related to the carbon trading, meager funding for the least developed countries or least developing countries, but lack of progress on loss and damage fund, the transition work program and the mitigation work program, and then the green climate mechanism, the RED Plus initiative, issues like food system, energy transition, biodiversity protection and taxation on the fossil fuel. It sparked the widespread disappointment, particularly among the third world countries and the countries like Pakistan, who are the most sufferers, who are the most vulnerable to climate change, and primarily because of the carbon emissions from the developed countries and its neighbors rather than Pakistan, because Pakistan has a meager 0.8% of the contribution into the carbon emission. And the vulnerability is unprecedented because just in 2022, we have faced a huge super flood when 1/3 of the country was underwater and billions of dollars of losses and the precious losses of life, property, economy, and we are suffering it every year in the form of multiple climate issues. To discuss what happened at COP29 and why it was categorized as a hypocritic COP, and even in the last 29 COPs, there was most of the times we have seen lots of lucrative promises, but no action. So, world needs practical. To discuss this scenario, we have in our studios Dr. Fasiha Safdar. She is the climate change expert from National Institute of Maritime Affairs. Most welcome to you, Fasiha. Thank you very much for your presence. And we have Talha Tufail Bhatti. He is the climate change researcher and working at the Institute of Regional Studies. Most welcome to you, Talha. Thank you very much for joining us. And online joining us, Ahmad Rafay. He is the prominent environmental lawyer and activist. Most welcome to you, Rafay sir. Thank you very much for your presence online. My first question to you, Fasiha, that COP29 was considered as the COP of action and finance and lots of hopes and expectations from that COP. But for new collective quantified goals with at least $300 billion of financing annually by 2035 for developing world against the UN goal of $500 billion. So it was short to the estimate. And then the African countries has estimated at least $1 trillion annually. Now, developed world also to mobilize $1.3 trillion annually by 2030. Do you think that it's enough as compared to the unprecedented losses and the developed countries' emissions? When rich countries spent at least $2.7 trillion in the last 12 years from 2010 to 2022 in fossil fuel subsidies?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. You are very right that this COP had a lot of expectations attached to it. I would not say that it was hopeless. They did reach a conclusion at the end. They tried very hard to reach a conclusion and make a deal at the end of the day. Yeah, I would like to highlight that it was their hard work that the Baku group, they extended the COP and the final declaration by 2 days. It was due to be announced, or the decision was to be announced on November 22nd, but the deal was reached at November 24th at 3 a.m. in the morning, and there was a long session of 33 hours where the heads of the states from around the world they gathered, and amid all the contentions and all the misunderstandings and disagreements, they ultimately did reach a point where the world agreed. So some agreement was made. It was not a bad deal, but it seems like an incomplete deal. So the world, the good thing was that the developing world did stand up for its rights. I was at the COP venue, and we witnessed that the developing countries and the activists from the developing countries, they did protest a lot throughout the 12 days, and especially on the last 2 days. We saw vast number of protesters outside the halls.
Means the developing world is proactive.
Yes, it is proactive, it is standing up for its rights.
They have shown that solidarity with their fellow countries and countrymen over there at the COP29. That's good. Ahmad Rafay Alam's with us. Ahmad, why there was under Paris Agreement, Article 1 and 2, success of the Just Transition Work Program is vital to achieve the global transition to the low emissions, address the challenges in sustainable economic development, eradicate poverty, equitable transition in overall aspects of the areas of energy, and then the socio-economic and the workforce and other dimensions. So how do you see this Just Transition Work Program, at which there was negligible progress done at the COP29?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Just transition is necessary because around the world, in the global south, there are people involved in industry, manufacturing, energy production, all of which will have to be changed given the climate crisis towards renewables, towards more sustainable industrial activity. And that change requires justice. You can't just stop industry. You have to replace it so that people in the global south still have jobs and can protect the environment and climate. The fact that there's very little that's happened in COP29 regarding the just transition speaks volumes on the COP process itself, actually.
So when Ahmad Rafay Alam sir, when we are talking about particularly the second very important segment, that is the mitigation work program, and that is again a very important benchmark when it comes to the Paris Agreement. It is vital to have the mitigation ambitions and their implementation process across the globe. So it was observed that during COP29 that discussion was consumed in disagreements and failed to reach any sort of a substantial outcome. So how do you see that? Because mitigation is the very important segment when it comes to the climate change, tackling the climate change, or importantly for the developing world particularly.
Yes, very much so. It's greenhouse gases that cause climate change, and we need to mitigate those, especially the global north needs to mitigate those greenhouse gases if we want to protect ourselves from, civilizational collapse going forward. The entire objective of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which the Conference of Parties meets every single year, is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. That agreement was signed in 1992, and to date we've had 29 COPs, none of which have had a firm commitment on mitigation and the elimination of greenhouse gases. So again, it's a very poor reflection on the COP process and, the future of human civilization almost.
So, Ahmad Rafay Alam sir, according to the UN estimates, adaptation financing needs for the developing countries are up to at least $415 billion annually by 2030 and at least $1.7 trillion by 2050. While the loss and damage fund at least needs $580 billion annually by 2030 and $1.7 trillion by 2050. But the pledges are far less than that, and particularly in COP29 there was negligible pledges out of that, and we have seen we are just moving in adaptation particularly regarding the COP28's around $700 billion of the pledges and stagnant with meager contributions. So especially when it comes to the lesser interest towards the developing world, why is it so?
This is a very good question. You see, the underlying principle of the United Nations Framework Convention, which is to stabilize greenhouse gases, is that less developed countries must adapt to the challenges of climate change, but because they are less developed, they require financing due from global north and developed countries. That's very much part of what this international process is. In 2010, the G20 agreed in Cancun, the COP that took place in Cancun in Bahamas, that they would raise $100 billion by 2020 for climate finance. Do you know that so far only $14 billion of that has actually been materialized? When the Loss and Damage Fund was announced in Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27 in 2022, a year later, only $700 million were pledged. Now we have promises of about $300 billion, but when you look back at the action of developed countries when it comes to finance, it is paltry, absolutely paltry. I should also remind you that this year, and this year alone, the United States approved $95 billion in aid to Israel and to Ukraine. And so the sad and sorry fact of the world is that there is money for war and for violence, but not to protect the lives and the properties and the futures of the global majority.
Yes, definitely, it's unfortunate. But Ahmad Rafay Alam Sahib, what's the progress of the 200 nations, especially the big polluters like India, China and the US, on halting the rising temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius and attain the safer goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, as agreed in the Paris Accord in 2015, especially to voluntary submissions of their emission reduction plans and the targets under the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, like renewable energy, electrifying transport and ending deforestation. But we have seen very meager movement on that front as well, and most of the countries are reluctant to submit their NDCs. Till now, we have very short data available on that.
Again, this sort of exposes the hypocrisy of the international law on climate change. You see, the point of this was to stabilize greenhouse gases. That's why these parties meet every single year. But do you know that we have produced on Earth more greenhouse gases since the signing of the UNFCCC in 1992 than in all of human history before that?
I think so. We have there was okay. Ahmad Rafay Alam Sahib, you want to add into that?
Point. My friend and mentor Adil Najam says that if you've tried something 29 times and failed, I think you should just call it a failure.
So do you think that world should ever recognize the sufferings of the third world countries when we have just noted that COP29 was bit under pressure when it comes to the US presidential elections and the Trump's victory, because Trump has the clear-cut policy. He don't believe in climate change, or he always say that it's skepticism or all that. So how do you see that the world leaders and the leading countries, and particularly those who are the responsible countries for the carbon emissions, they are not realizing that how much sufferings and how much destruction is there in the third world?
I believe that people see the suffering. However, leaders of global north countries are insulated by their own political constituencies. And as long as they can exist politically while the rest of the world dies of climate change, they will continue this line of hypocrisy. I've been very disappointed by the United Nations COP process and the promises that have been made and consistently broken, much to the cost of the people in the global south.
Thank you very much, Ahmad Rafay Alam Sahib, for your precious time, because we know that you have a very busy schedule. Thank you very much for your candid views as well. Talha, as Ahmad Rafay Alam Sahib was saying, regarding the climate summit in Azerbaijan, it was widely believed that the summit was overshadowed, as we were talking about the Trump's administration coming up in the next year. So do you think that it is like that, and why it was that COP29 was undermined despite of that it was the very important COP in a sense that lots of decisions would be made over there. And because of the absence of the US, China, India, France, Germany, European Commission, because these were the countries who have to lead, but they were missing over there. So do you think that there was more advocacy for the fossil fuel, rather the climate justice, the final outcome not mentioned the transitioning away from the fossil fuels. That was, it means that it's a one step back when it comes to 28. And resultantly, it left many third world countries in a sheer disappointment.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And yes, you are right. I mean, we have to understand that in the last 3 years, the COP was happening in the petrostates. And Egypt was the petrostate, UAE was the petrostate, Azerbaijan was a petrostate. So we need to identify this pattern, that what presidency we are choosing for the COP itself. And there's also another thing which I want to add this. In the last 20 years or the 30 years, as Rafay mentioned it, the emissions have gone up. And the USA was under different administrations, but the stance remained same. They left no opportunity to shrink down their historic responsibility, discredit this human right thing, and discredit this climate justice. They always talk to in a manner where they don't have any legal binding in regards to UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement to give reparations to the developing world. So we need to understand this. This is a Paris Agreement, and UNFCCC is a non-binding treaties we have.
Definitely.
And the UN actually go for the International Court of Justice for their advisory opinion on climate change, historic emission, that what should be the developing world stance in that regard, because the developing world is strongly pursuing this accountability narrative, that whatever pledges they made in the recent COPs or in the last COPs, they had to be accountable on that too. So there are 98 countries, and this plenary hearing is actually going on nowadays. It started from 2nd of December and will continue to 12th of December too. And 98 countries are giving their stance into the International Court of Justice in that regard. So once that is completed, then the International Court of Justice can share his advisory opinion in the light of international law. But again, you have to remember this: these opinions are non-binding forces. They cannot be, they cannot force any country or any state to give certain type of funds or grants in anywhere possible.
Definitely.
So G7 is not even serious about this thing. And they also, I want to add into this, not only the G7, the petrostates too, because the petrostate always said that we are not the historic emissions, but as we know from the IPCC reports, that AR6 report mentioned that from 1990 to 2020, we emitted 48% of the greenhouse gas emissions if you look at the historic.
That's why that phrase was coined, that rather than ending the fossil fuel consumption, just transitioning away. Yeah. So transitioning away also now eliminated when it comes to the final text of the outcome. So that was not there.
Well, just wanted to add into this in our Just Transition Energy Program, UE, which actually started. The presidency actually hold the text in the first week. And the last day of the first week, the presidency released the text in which the terminology was considered to be framed around the rights and the gender equality thing, rather than on the just transition. Actually, in the last year, in COP28, UNFCCC agreed on the labor rights too. The labor had certain rights in the industry. You want to shift the industry, it's a good thing, but the labor have two rights because they are dependent upon that particular industry. So if you briefly
tell us about that International Court of Justice advisory, how much it is important, if you just briefly tell us about that.
They are not binding to any.
Obviously.
But they have a significant political weightage that could be floated into the COP next year, because developed countries are moving towards in that direction where they are just simply saying no to them. And just in Transition Energy Program, in the last day, the text was shared at the last day of it. And there was no time for the developing countries to even understand the text and intercept it in a manner where they can present their own case. So, I mean, the whole process was stagnant by the COP presidency itself. So we cannot say it's developing world, it's the presidency who is actually flawed.
Definitely, you are absolutely right on that. Dr. Fasiha, what do you think, because you have attended the COP as well, what do you think that new collective quantified goals, financing, whether that would be in the form of grants or loans, what about the financial aids and the pledges, especially the multilateral development bank announcements regarding the annual climate financing and all that. So how do you see how much important it is, and particularly when we are talking about the innovative financing in that perspective?
Okay, so I'll start with an introduction of the new collective quantified goals. This was the COP which had to introduce this idea that we have to define what we are going to do for the climate action, both the developing countries and the developed countries as well. There is a new block that has risen, that is the emerging economies block. So it's not only about the developing and the developed countries, the focus has also shifted on the emerging economies like China and India now. So there was a lot of contention between the countries at the COP for redefining their contribution. The developed countries were very reluctant to increase their contribution, financial as well as technical, in the form of grants or loans or any sort of help to the developing countries. They were very reluctant to increase that because they said that the emerging economies are now polluting the world more than they are polluting the world. So they wanted to put some blame on the emerging economies as well. The developing countries, on the other hand, they said they reminded the developed countries of their historical responsibility, and they said that the new financial goal, which ultimately was announced as the Baku financial goal, that has to be in the form of grants, not in the form of loans or in the form of any private.
That's why the developed world wants that emerging economies must have to be listed once again.
Yes,
and that
yes,
China,
right.
India, most of the countries, they are opposing it because they think about that they are the developing countries and they need finances rather than to be just categorized as the emerging economies and club it with the developed world.
Yes, so, and you're right, but at the end of the day, there was also a problem with the amount and the mechanism of that amount. How would that be dispersed? So the developed world and the developing countries, they both agreed at the end, half-heartedly, both of the sides. They agreed on the amount of $300 billion per year by the year 2035.
Definitely.
But they also agreed that the financial banks, the multilateral banks and the international financing institutes, they would also come into play. The bigger international organizations, the World Bank organizations which support green energy transitions and green projects, they would also come into play, and some funds would be released as private funding. So the developed countries did not like the term of the private funding because they said that it deviates the responsibility away from the governments of the developed countries. Definitely. So this was actually a bone of contention there as well. Both the sides stood their ground, and there was a mid ground which was agreed to, and the term that was used was that there would be a financial contribution of 300 billion rupees, but in total by 2035, combining all the financial, the public and the private components of the financial instruments, the total amount that would be released for climate action would be
That's
around
why the developing countries are
agitating
that $300 billion is not enough amount.
Yes, so $1.3 trillion is the amount that the developing countries are trying for.
Definitely.
And it was agreed upon half-heartedly by the
So, Talha, as Dr. Fasiha said, how do you see the effective legal and the financial support, and particularly to the food systems and the energy transition mechanisms, the biodiversity protection, imposition of the taxation on fossil fuels particularly, and the harmful chemicals and the adverse substances on environment? Because it seems negligible progress at the COP29 on these vital issues of humanity, because we haven't seen anything in the final communique.
Well, I mean, if you look at the COP processes, there are 3 COPs. The first one is on biodiversity, the second one is on climate, and the third one is on desertification on the land. If you look at all of 3, the answer is quietly same. We do not have the political will to do certain things. We have enough.
Although in the COP of biodiversity, the world leaders, particularly from the developing countries, they advocated it, that there is a sheer threat to the biodiversity across the developing countries. But unfortunately, there was no word from that.
There are certain programs which are initiated, like at this COP, there is a Rio Trio program which was initiated, in which they want to strengthen the Convention of Biodiversity, or the Rio Convention on Biodiversity.
Obviously.
And they want to strengthen the mechanisms of it, and they want to have this Convention on biological diversity of 2. because most of the times when we see the natural side of it, the biodiversity is losing like we are losing glaciers right now in the north. The losses are humongous in that regard, and if you look at the this year's COP which is going on in Riyadh for desertification,
definitely.
that executive of that particular COP mentioned that the amount we need by 2030 only for the land is 2.6 trillion. So now we are not even talking about billions, we are talking about trillions in that regard. So the losses are huge. So just you need to understand it, we already crossed that particular point.
One factor is that world community has never taken this climatic changes seriously, and we have never invested into rather its mitigation, adaptation or any other mechanism in that particular front. So that's why the losses are now piling up. And we have, that's why we have to now invest trillions of dollars, and most of the times in future, God knows better, there might be we have more enormous amount required for that. So Dr. Fasiha, whether the carbon market governance under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement becomes more operational after COP29 as the country-to-country trading, the carbon crediting mechanism, Article 6.2, agreed standards for a centralized carbon market under the UN supervision, Article 6.4. So, right to appeal, mandatory safeguards to protect the environment and the human rights were agreed upon. And what about the transparency and accountability?
Yeah. So this is one of the successes of COP29. Carbon mechanism was agreed upon, which ended the almost 10-year limbo of the carbon markets. So there was a mechanism, clean development mechanism before this carbon pricing mechanism, which was putting a hold, some sort of a hold at the international carbon market, because there was not a centralized carbon marketing system. This year the world agreed to a centralized carbon marketing system under the United Nations overall surveillance. So because of that, there would be a better chance for the developing countries to get finances because of their greener transition projects. There was obviously the discussions at the COP revolved around the mechanisms as to how would the developing countries get that money. The developed world focused on very strict regulatory mechanisms, and the developing countries said that because of their lack of expertise and lack of capacity, the tough reporting mechanisms becomes a burden for them, and it hinders their development and movement in the carbon market. But the developed countries still focused on very rigid reporting mechanisms, and but ultimately the carbon market mechanism and the text was agreed upon, and it would enable the developing countries to actually reach out if there are greener energy transition projects or low carbon projects happening in the setting up in the developing world. They would be able to get money out of the international market now. The carbon market laid a lot of stress on increased accountability and very transparency, because the text, the negotiations also reflected some sort of a mistrust between the developing and the developed world. To some extent it was correct because of the governance issues in the developing countries as well. So the rigid mechanism that has been devised to monitor the carbon markets, that would keep in check the governance issues in the developing countries. The carbon markets are also very rigid in some clauses which say that the money that would be earned by the developing countries through the carbon markets, they should be then invested in the fight against the climate change.
Definitely, you are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. Talha, during COP27, the loss and damage fund was proposed and it was announced. Then in COP28 agreed its operationalization and to have some work to be done. Then we have seen that intense negotiations happened, some of the meetings, then the World Bank became the executing body on that, and the executive director was also appointed for the 4 years. What about means of implementation mentioned at the COP29 as enabling factor? So resource availability and disbursement mechanism and the processes, How do you see that?
I mean, it's a live process right now. I mean, the board is actually meeting regularly. The fourth board meeting just ended yesterday, and they decided this blanket accreditation.
Although there is nothing in the COP29, but do you think that it is going to be more beneficial for the developing world in future?
I mean, for the developing world, it should be beneficial, but I have
Either must be, because
I have strong reservations on the funding process. Who going to fund into this?
Definitely, this is the main question, because who is going to fund, who is going to take care of it, and what would be the ultimate disbursement mechanism? Because again, it is going to be very tough when it comes to the carbon markets and all that.
Yeah, I mean, loss and damage fund is specifically for the losses of any state. Specifically, they are different realms of it.
Yes.
So the loss and damage fund would directly look into the natural disasters which happened. According to EM DAT report, in the last year we have 399 disasters, and the bill was around $240 billion. So you can imagine this when the fund is actually ready, and when they have this certain amount of funders for this particular facility, they are going to transmit it into a manner. But again, you need to realize this. You're not the vulnerable country anymore, only vulnerable country anymore. There are 100 more countries which are vulnerable, and they have better mechanisms in their frameworks which can present themselves in a manner they can harness those financial resources. The problem lies in a manner where the funding comes from. The G7 and the petro-states are not willing to finance this. Even if in regards to China, China actually wanted to fund more in this COP, but they didn't see any willingness from the developed world itself too. And if you look at the ICG, they are categorically saying this is not a binary thing for us.
Obviously.
We can do whatever we want to do, and they will increase our emissions. And I can say that the things will get tougher before they get easier in the longer run.
Definitely, you are absolutely right. Fasiha, how do you see the recent climate summit encouraging civil society, women, youth, even children and indigenous communities to be effective part of the climate summit process through gender equality and mainstreaming by agreeing to extend the Lima work program on gender and climate change for another 10 years, then agreed on the new gender action plan for adaptation or adoption at the COP 30 next year in Brazil, and establishing action for climate empowerment and inclusion of the children within the youth-led climate forum. So how do you see this whole mechanism? Do you think this is the step which really very important to own our youth and our children, who are the real future? So they must have to decide that and we have to listen them what they want.
Yes. So this year at the COP, there were a lot of youth organizations, and the voice of the youth was very prominent over there. When we were attending the different events at the different pavilions set up by the countries, we saw that there were many events related to the voice of the youth to be highlighted, and the youth were given a center stage at this COP. We hope that this will continue in the future as well. There were a lot of technological solutions that were showcased in different pavilions by the youth of Pakistan as well as the youth of other countries, and there were special programs and spaces allocated for the youth where they could negotiate, and the youth were brought together from different parts of the world so that they could negotiate and work in unity around the globe. Then there was a decision on the Lima work plan for the gender. It was agreed, it was first agreed in the 2014 COP, and this year it was agreed that this would be extended for the next 10 years, and then revisions would be made in the 2020.
What's the significance of this? Because how much it is significant when it will be extended for another 10 years? What issues we are going to address through this?
Yes, so the Lima work plan on gender, it significantly marked, it highlighted that climate change is not a uniform subject. It has an intersectionality of gender. It has a dimension of gender, so which is particularly highlighted in developing countries where already there is a gender disparity, a gender inequality. So under the societal occurrence of gender inequality, climate change impacts then widen the gender inequality and the gender gap. So the Lima work plan actually wants or it binds the countries, the parties of the UNFCCC to make plans and policies, all the climate change policies, to include gender into their consideration.
Your point well taken, Fasiha. Right now we have Munir Ahmad Sahab. He is the climate advocacy expert and executive director DEFCON. Most welcome to you, Munir Sahab. Thank you very much for joining us. How do you see the COP29 and its progression, basically, because the outcomes are not much hopeful, but at least some of the movement we have seen in the outcome, the final communique what was issued. So do you think that what are the benefits there for Pakistan, and how we have to gear up for climate diplomacy and climate negotiations internationally, because Pakistan is the main vulnerable country when it comes to the climate change?
You are quite right. Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries, and we have been facing a lot of disasters because of the climate impact. But unfortunately, the Conference of Parties, we have seen they have never been come to certain concrete steps. Whenever developed countries made some promises, but they were never fulfilled. Look at the Paris Agreement and even damage fund. Funds not given to the developing countries and those who are suffering from the losses and from the climate impact. COP29, as you mentioned, that it was again, it was met by the 13 leading countries in the carbon emissions. The countries, those have 70% of the emissions. And in the absence of those 30 countries, the COP29 could not do anything. So we really fear that if the countries a future of the humanity we are in danger. And certainly we need a lot of funds, the country like Pakistan, but the pledges were made after 2022 floods. Even they were so it's a vague situation. The clusters of developing countries need to raise voice more strongly and compel different forums to come on their back to force the developed world to put their
definitely force the developed world to have some sort of interest in the developing world as well. Thank you very much, Munir Ahmad Sahab, for being with us. I think so there is some distortion in the line as well. So, Talha, according to many experts, is it right that the climate summit is mostly used as a viable platform to protect emitters? And unfortunately, their fossil fuel trade, the industries, including the automobile, the shipping, airlines, the businesses, and now especially when we are talking about the US President-elect Donald Trump will be in White House, environmentalists are actually feared upon that climate negotiations would hurt badly, and the climate justice would be a distant dream. And finances, which are not there now as well, would get dried up.
Well, we need to understand this process of COP itself. After Paris Agreement, we actually have this fossil fuel tax in it that we want to transition away from it. We have Green Climate Fund, we have Loss and Damage Fund, we have ample frameworks which are present afterwards. But we need to understand that it's now, we have to shift it to the implementation mode. The
Yes.
COP need to shift into implementation mode. We do not need a single COP.
We have
every year.
lots of negotiations from the last 29 years, but we have to now be practical.
Yeah, there are 4 practical ways through which we can have it. The first one is we need to understand which country is holding the COP itself. The presidency, the seat of president is very important. The second one is we need to add science into it, authentic science into our negotiations. Because merely we are talking about political targets, and right now in the COPS process itself, and we need to streamline this urgency of scale and capacity of multiple nations, that this is the only currency we have. Scale and time is the only currency we have right now, regardless of any other thing. We are drying up this particular currency if we start on these processes the way it is. And the Trump administration is, I feel like the American administration itself is on the business as usual model. It's not about Trump, it's not about Biden, it's not about any other person XYZ you can add it. They are on high emitting scenario, and they are going to be at high emitting scenario. By Trump, you can add 4 billion tons of CO2 into the system by 2030. So it's not about it. It's not about who is at the presidency. The administration itself of G7 is on this regard.
Definitely.
So,
Dr. Fasiha, we have very run short of time, so be brief on that. Many believe the developed world non-serious approach and the vague pledges, because Pakistan's, like resilient Pakistan conference in Geneva, we haven't got anything out of that. Multiplying disasters actually, that impact of the climate change. Now, who will contribute finances? What Talha said. Who will implement it? As developed world always brings some new mechanisms in every climate summit, wasting the precious time as well, the protecting their interests, even if the funding get available, that whether it will be loan or aid. This is the huge question what the developing world is actually asking. Developing world don't intend to be now burdened up with loans and all that. So now this vicious circle, the global north getting cover and the global south is actually left vulnerable.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
In my views, the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities should be taken very seriously amongst the north and the south, both global north and the south. So the common goal of saving our earth, saving our climate is the common goal, but we have different responsibilities. The north has already shifted to a greener economy now after utilizing the fossil fuels in the past, while the global south is now on the pathway towards greener energy resources. So in my view, even if the north is shunning its responsibilities, which it is, the south has a lot to do on its own as well, shifting towards lower carbon emissions and focusing a lot on their mitigation and adaptation plans. They can work on their national scale.
Just two things, the finances and implementation. What do you think?
The finances would flow ultimately, even if America walks out, the European Union and the other blocs, the emerging countries, emerging economies, they can take the lead without America as well. But the developing countries need to make sure that their governance is in place as well.
Okay, your
So
point
both
well
are
taken. Thank you very much for your presence here.
Thank
Dr. Fasiha, thank you very much. So nice of you. Thank you, so nice of you, Talha, for being here and very brief and elaborated views, really. Viewers, you have listened to our panelists today, and it's a huge subject when it comes to the climate change, and particularly even the Conference of Parties and negotiations, even its plenaries or whatever it is. But it is important that we have to decide once that who has the presidency. That is important area. We have to decide now that how the funding would be, what would be the funding resource and from where it would be available. And then the implementation, that is important. Responsibilities, South, Global South and Global North, all have to take their responsibility. Ultimately, this globe, this earth belongs to, this is the only planet to live. There is no other planet. So we have to be focused on that. Joint transition and mitigation work programs must have to be dealt with, because these are the areas which are going to decide the future course of the climate negotiation. The Red Plus for the forestry and particularly the Green Climate Fund, loss and damage fund as well, and the just energy transition. These are the areas which must have to be focused by the developed and developing world as well. ICJ advisory is also, International Court of Justice is going to give its advisory sooner or later, but it is very important, although non-binding, but that is important to consider if ethically we want to live in this globe with dignity and honor. And we have all the rights available, right to have clean air, clean water, and clean living. So if the world is actually spending billions of dollars, at least 95 billion, more than 95 billion dollars into the Gulf, into the Middle East war, particularly in Gaza and all others, why not to invest into our future generations for the greener future? And also the world has to spend something on this fossil fuel issue, because fossil fuels are actually destroying our environment and creating lots of global warming that ultimately impacting our climate. So we have to focus now, because time is running out, and we have to act now, because this is the time of action, not the statements. This is today's Foresight. It's time to sign off. Allah Hafiz Nasir.